thank you everybody for joining today. Before we jump in, a quick intro for anyone that's new to Salto. Salto is not just putting up these nice webinars, right? We're a Salesforce DevOps platform making deployment smoother for the whole team. Some of the challenges you'll hear about today can be solved with Salto, and you'll hear about that later on. Some others might require a little more diplomacy, and Julian will talk about that. We'll start with a poll in just a minute or a few seconds. I'll start it now, actually, just to better understand the makeup of your team. Without further ado, let's hear more about today's speaker, Julian and Dan, and I'll see you again towards the end.
Great. Thanks so much, Baptiste. Yeah, so my name is Julian Joseph. You may have seen me on the last webinar, pronounce he, him. I am a Salesforce DevOps evangelist working here alongside Salto, trying to turn off my smart speaker so it doesn't interrupt. And yeah, I've also been a DevOps engineer, Salesforce DevOps engineer for the past, depending on how you look at it, between 4 to 8 years. Been doing the role for a while now. And so that's included at companies like GoFundMe, Salesforce through Salesforce.org, which is the nonprofit division of Salesforce, if you will. AgentSync, another partner, BOK Financial most recently. And a few facts about me, I have over 100 smart home devices. My partner completely loves that, especially when I'm randomly turning off things in the rooms that he's in, accidentally, of course. And yeah, I just love to do that. There's a link there for some of my social ways that you can follow me, connect with me. And one more fun fact, I am actually very recently engaged as of this past weekend. So yeah, thanks so much. I see some clapping. Yeah, really appreciate that. Yeah, it was a complete surprise to me. Somehow my fiance planned it for over a year, and still surprised me even with our best friends present. And so, yeah, thanks so much for being a part of the webinar right after that event. If I mess up at all, I'll just blame it on I had a long weekend because, it's a big surprise. So I'll go ahead and briefly hand it off to Dan.
I don't have anything quite that exciting. That is a fun surprise. So congrats, Julian. Dan Putman, Salto customer engineer, which means I get to do all the fun stuff, technical questions, demos, trials, onboarding, fun stuff. So I am not from the Salesforce ecosystem originally. So I was engineering team lead, things like that before I got into doing more customer facing roles. The fun thing I did get to do, though, is after my engineering life, I became an advisor to a number of startups, and I got to have a really fun adventure as co-founding a renewable energy company. So I was doing the very soft part of it. I had someone else handling the hardware and the actual solar part of it, but that was an absolute blast. Before it flamed out, and we had our second kid, and I was like, we got to go probably pull in some revenue if I want this kid to go to college. So I spend the rest of my time chasing around my 3 young daughters, and I have yet to turn over my the control of my house to Julian. Although, who knows? Who knows? Maybe one day I'll have random lights turning on and off.
It's coming. Appreciate it. So yeah, so today, jumping into the topic, the reason y'all are all here. So you may have seen a few different posts about what we're discussing. The admin to dev handoff is one thing we've been kind of putting out there, and also just admins and devs and how they're working on teams together. The real focus is just to talk about these two very prominent roles on Salesforce teams and how they each work a bit differently, and how that can create some challenges or complexities when you're trying to create more cohesion within the team and better understand what are some solutions to that. And so, more specifically, what we're talking about is, of course, why this matters, what each of these roles, what their involvement in the DevOps process typically looks like, how their work basically gets out there. We'll be talking about specifically what the handoff between each, typically, yeah, what that looks like as well. So if work is transitioning or going over from admin to dev or dev to admin, where that happens or maybe doesn't happen. A little bit of foreshadowing there. And then we'll talk about a few ways that we can support this, or a few solutions from a bit of a bigger picture point of view. And then really digging into specifically what is Salto's way of supporting this, and what is Salto's solution. And that's where I'll be handing it off more to Dan, but we may be interjecting as we go along the webinar. So yeah, a bit more of a conversation. But again, why does this matter? And so admins and devs, of course, you probably each have your own ways of working. And so your own tools that you may be a little bit more familiar with. Hopefully there is already some cohesion there in terms of some similar tools that you're using. But more often than not, at least from my experience, what I've seen is there's still a preferred method for each, and there's a preferred tool set. Totally understandable. We're going to be looking at what those are, and how they can connect with each other. The reason we're doing this is we, of course, want to minimize things like rework. In particular, you don't want an admin to redoing what a dev's doing, or vice versa. I would say especially that takes place maybe not so much on actually doing the work as much as with the conversation about the work itself. You don't want to, therefore, of course, have to re-explain yourself multiple times and re-understand the work you're trying to do. And so often what happens is there needs to be this, at times, translation between what the admin is trying to accomplish and the way that looks in code, or often what the dev has accomplished, and how to understand how to test and implement that with all the other declarative and components within Salesforce. And so looking at specifically first what an admin, what their style of DevOps is, and the way that they get work in, and the way that they get their changes in. Sorry, just turning off the notification here. For admin DevOps, we're usually thinking of things like org to org style working. And so, I mean, the classic change sets as a way of moving code around, moving components around, things that you've changed. Of course, there's a number of more modern tools that handle this, but I would say many of those tools and many of those methods may involve this idea of, oh, I want to move these components from this environment, these fields from this environment, pick list, whatever it is, layouts from this environment up to another one. These different sandboxes typically before it's ready to go out to production. And so, admins, from what I've seen, typically think about it in this sense, not necessarily using something like version control, although sometimes that is operating within the background, but really thinking from that org to org moving. Also, in terms of the style of the tool that is being used, is often bringing in this idea of a UI-based tool. And so what I'm talking about there is the Saltos of the world, or some of the other ones out there, Gearset, Capado, things like that. Thinking of these tools where you actually have a UI that you're interacting with in order to pull in components that you've changed, and again, move them and promote them to orgs. Again, some of those, as I think we'll see, have integrations with version control. But the idea is like the admin is probably used to actually clicking and moving things around in a declarative way, just like they would declaratively in an org themselves. One of the challenges that comes up, and this is by no means comprehensive, it's not the only challenge, but one of the challenges that comes up with the style development often is actually rolling back and auditing these changes, because these changes are happening within an org environment. You don't necessarily always have a way to see what has happened over time. Of course, there are ways to do that. I'm just thinking of whether it's like audit history within the org or some other setup tool. It's not impossible, but it can be a real challenge at scale to be able to like view these things and then roll them back whenever you have deployed something that you don't want to, or whenever you want to verify what has already been deployed. And once more, just emphasizing, everything from a admin's point of view tends to be viewed as a component. So not as code itself per se, even though it can all be translated for the most part that way, but everything is thought of as a specific component, a field, a list view, page layout, permission set, whatever it is. It's like you're thinking about what the actual view is within Salesforce, what the actual component is within Salesforce. Now, to contrast this with developer DevOps, again, how they're moving code around. Typically for a developer, a dev, that looks like Git, CI/CD tooling. And so this is version control. This is the code itself. I would say also paired with the CI/CD part, which is automations to be able to do things like effectively code spell check, thinking about PMD and code scan and tools like that, as well as potentially even automatically doing different kinds of deployments between orgs and things like that. Just that expectation that that part is happening and connected to the version control. Also, of course, is this notion of having pull requests, which is the GitHub term for it, but there's also, merge requests. Each tool might call it something a little bit different, but basically this layer of, if we're going to promote something between, in this case, branches, which may or may not represent the orgs themselves. The way a dev typically likes to work is create something like a pull request and actually have other devs review, get involved, and comment potentially on that work, on that code that's going out. And so where one of the challenges on that dev side, especially when thinking about it in the context of working on this team, where we're handing off work between different team members, is that, again, that requirement for translating what is happening in the code into something like components. Everything is typically in metadata, XML, besides, of course, there's the Apex code itself, but when we're thinking about some of the other components that kind of get translated more readily, that's going to be the metadata XML version of each of these components. And so from a dev's point of view, often there may need to be some level of translation into, oh, I'm actually taking this kind of XML and if it's being deployed to org, it's actually going to look this way when it gets into org. I will say a lot of devs typically are pretty aware of what they're doing on that end. So it's not, the translation isn't necessarily a challenge for them, but it can be a challenge in translating it for somebody else who's trying to get involved. I would even put in there maybe translating it in the context of understanding all the dependencies that are involved. It's one thing to think, oh, I need to deploy this set of XML and put it out there. I need to deploy this XML and put it out there for this admin to test or for these other users to test. But it's another thing to think about, okay, what is all that XML in this case representing? Like, if I can't just deploy the field, for example, I might need to also deploy the permission set and the layout that field is going to go on, and maybe pick list values and all these other things. I would say it's fairly easy to not think about that from the code perspective, or to miss it when you're actually either training somebody else on it or even deploying it on your own. And so once again, everything from that dev perspective is typically thought of as code. It's the metadata itself. It's not necessarily the components, although of course they represent the components, but if you're thinking about it and you're interacting with it from that version control in that metadata perspective. Jumping on over into the actual handoff. So we talked about each of the ways that the dev and admin might work in this kind of deployment scenario. Now, how about when they're actually handing off work to each other? What does that actually look like? And really, what are the challenges that come up there? Focusing in on those. And so I was already beginning to touch on it, but when handing off work from, let's say, in this case, from an admin to a dev, you might run into situations where dependencies are missing. And so you're missing those layouts, you're missing those permission sets. I would actually say that can kind of go both ways. But thinking about, oh, if we're pulling in this field, again, thinking about some of the UI tools that an admin might be using to capture a component or some other piece of data, they might just pull in the field. And this is the thing I want to deploy, but not thinking about what are all the other dependencies. That can be a challenge if that tool has no way of knowing about what dependencies are there, or of warning the admin, hey, there's more that you've done here. And so those can get missed. There's the issue of potentially limited visibility into what devs are working on. And so from the admin perspective, again, the dev, if especially if they're working with pull requests and these tool and they're working in version control, and again, the admin is working on the org side, the visibility there into, okay, when I'm going to deploy something, if there's no connection, if there's no visibility into those pull requests, or if there is visibility, but there isn't understanding of, hey, what does this code actually mean? How is it translated from the components into the code and vice versa? Then there's some missing knowledge there, and there's some like difficulty in that transition. And so that's one of the challenges. And then I would say that kind of brings in this idea of like, we probably need some better integration between these two, between that UI tool and the version control tool that devs are using that kind of represent does that translation for the admin or dev. Otherwise, again, it's getting lost. And getting a little bit more specific as to what this may, one effect of this issue, one effect of these challenges. I'm calling it like the throw it over the wall scenario. And so this is the situation, and this I will just say has come from real world experience at different companies where I've seen some of these things happen. And so this throw it over the wall idea, which I honestly want to find a better way of saying this because it feels a little malicious to say throw it over all. I don't think it's like intentional as much as, especially as much as what you're seeing in the little GIF right here, somebody just kind of doing it. But I think what tends to happen is when an admin might make a change and they're in a situation, especially if their team works in a way where everything's got to go through version control, which by the way, I think has a lot of benefits. If they're working in that situation, they might have to hand it off to a dev, and a dev really has to take care of the next step of that, of merging those changes in, of taking the code that the admin has essentially pulled in from the org changes they made, translated into code, and then the actual promotion to the next branch/org that has to take place on the dev side. But what can happen there pretty easily is, okay, I've done my work as an admin. I've pulled these things in or I've identified them. Okay, it's up to the dev to do the rest of it. If everything was done perfectly, that might be totally fine. But when those dependencies are missed, when those components are not fully understood, and that work is essentially being handed off to the dev side, it's very easy for it to be just another thing to add to the backlog that just needs to be merged in. And I will say also from my work of being a quality engineer in the past, that's where a lot of the bugs can come up. A lot of things can be missed if you just merge that code in. Just like if you were a dev merging in code, you wouldn't just want to merge it in. You would want to have it reviewed and thought through. But how do you do that when the changes are actually coming from your admin? Well, now you have to talk with them and again, do that retranslation, that understanding, that handoff of knowledge before you actually push those changes up. Not a horrible thing in and of itself, but just something to recognize that can slow the work down, that can make it more difficult if you don't have that visibility being transferred from the admin to the dev. Looking at the dev to admin handoff. And so we're talking about what happens kind of when you're thinking about it from that org perspective, from that UI perspective. Now it's like look at from the dev version control and how that translates back over on the admin side. And so one of the challenges can be some of the code on the dev side. I mean, code is really particular, right? So it needs to be formatted properly in certain ways. And so what I've seen mostly is actually devs, especially if they're working with components, they are often pulling directly from the org into version control that way. And so that's great, but it's just something to note that if you are a dev and you're just wanting to work with code specifically, if you just code everything out, like if I wanted to code a field, I could, a Salesforce field, but if it's not properly formatted, it's not going to deploy properly. And so that's just going to slow me down on that end. And so knowing that even on the dev side, there's probably some interaction with the org, just calling that out. Metadata inconsistencies causing deployment failures. So this is just another challenge. Like if you want to hand off this work, so you've done this coding, you've coded things out. If you're trying to hand it off to an admin it's got to make it to an org. And so you're going to have to work through various deployment failures and things like that. And so once again, there's some like value in being able to have work coming from either an admin or dev doing that work in the org itself and then pulling it into version control. There's a number of advantages there. Anything non-Apex related, I would say, is something that's fair game to really consider. Like there's going to be some challenges if it's like directly, if I'm only thinking about the version control piece of it in this from that dev perspective. And then another challenge that often comes up is when you need to actually do something with that code, we need to promote that code as a dev. And if you're wanting to involve an admin, if they're the ones maybe testing this work or validating it, or they're having some input on it, we come into the challenge of pull requests, that tool for that mechanism for promoting things in version control. There's often not the same familiarity from the admin side as with the dev side. And so that's just another area where things can be slowed down. If an admin wants to look at all the components that the dev is trying to promote, for example, if it's a traditional just GitHub pull request, that's going to be a challenge because it's just all going to be XML. Maybe that's comfortable for the dev. It's probably not as comfortable for the admin, especially if you start to think about adding in comments and things like that to the code itself, or like interacting, trying to give some feedback from the admin perspective to the dev. If it's just straight up code and that admin is basically not trained on code typically, then there's going to be that loss of translation, lack of understanding. And then actually, I'm just going to go on to the next one right here and just like talk about the challenge, what I see this going into. And so the situation that I have again seen happen real world in this admin to dev to admin handoff is actually just that it doesn't happen a lot of times. And so for the admin side, it might be a bit more throw it over the wall. It does happen because it's got to happen. It's got to go over to the devs to be promoted, but they're not going to know they don't know what's I've done. On the dev side, I feel like it typically goes more into the space of, oh, I'm just going to do it as a dev. I'm just going to work with the other devs on the team. I'm just going to promote it myself because I'm not going to train somebody else on how to use PRs, pull requests, version control, that side of things. Effectively working in a completely siloed environment from the admins. Not always. I don't want to say this is always like a terrible scenario. It's not. There's nothing wrong with working with other devs and getting things promoted. But there is some level of, if you are working on a pretty interconnected team where you're trying to understand what everybody else is doing on that team, which there's a lot of best practices that say that's the way we want to work. You want to be bringing in those admins. You want to be bringing in, especially maybe if you have QAs on the team. I would say a lot of QAs, quality engineers, typically are effectively admins, but with this very specific task of testing. And so they, similar to admins, are not going to be involved on that coding side of things as much and necessarily understand all the details of it. They really just want to know what to test. But if you're working in a way where, oh, I'm just promoting everything is making it up to higher environments, and only us devs know what's going on because we are using these tools that only show it from the dev perspective, then you're cutting out a benefit of having other input on that team, and you're probably cutting out people from knowing how to best test your work or validate it as you go down the pipeline. So what are some ways that this helps? Of course, in a second, we'll be looking at more specifically the way Salto addresses this. But just a few things to think about also, I would say, from the team perspective. So just adding in and having things like regular admin and dev reviews of work. One challenge I've seen here is there often are reviews of work going on most teams, but they might be admin or dev specific, separated. Again, if that makes sense for if those two groups are completely not overlapping in any way, maybe that makes sense. But when you have some level of overlap, you probably need some cohesion on what work is being promoted and what that actually looks like. How is it? What does it look like on the component side? What does it look like on the code side? How are those going to interact together as we move work up our DevOps pipeline? And so having ways to review that with each other Of course, having a great tool to like visualize and all those things will make it so much easier. But at the very least, starting today or starting as soon as possible, if there isn't that kind of like cohesive review happening of each other's work and that translation happening of, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what this code means, or hey, these are the components that I've got. This is understanding where these are in the life cycle of the deployment, and not just like throwing it over the wall again. Having that space, I think, is really important. And then another, I would say, piece of that is like really thinking about what team agreements can be agreed upon, to ensure that some of these things are happening in ways that support each of the roles. And so, for example, when supporting admins, I'm usually thinking a lot about potentially having an agreement to make sure that all of our items, like if let's say we're using Jira or some other tool to track the progress of our work, making sure that those are all updated with their status and location. Because again, when you get into the like throw over the wall kind of view, the admins might not know what's going on the dev side, when that's getting promoted, how that's all working. And then another example of a potential team agreement to support devs is looking at what ticket should, or making sure that a ticket is fully updated before it is assigned to that dev. And so in that scenario, again, where admin is, let's say, giving work to a dev or handing that off, to help reduce levels of rework, recommunication, retranslation, just making sure, for example, that that information is pretty clearly documented in a way that it can be easily handed off. I think a meeting to talk about work is always great. Sometimes we're limited on time, we can't do that. So at the very least, making sure that that work is really clearly documented, when what components were being pulled in, what the status of it is, when it's being handed off. And then finally, this is leading into what we'll be talking about next with Dan, but looking at ways to integrate and centralize that work. And so, especially again, thinking about, we have pull requests with admins, we have these UI tools with devs. Is there a way that we can look at all this together in one space so that when we do the reviews of work, we're all looking at the same thing, when we're trying to figure out what is the status of items, where they have progressed throughout the development pipeline, where do those things actually live, what stage have they made them to, what stage have they made them to, and then considering tooling that does that for us as much as possible. Obviously, that's going to make it so much easier. So with that, I'll be passing it off to Dan. I'll be sticking around as well, maybe commenting from time to time. But yeah, I'd love to see what Sato's got in terms of addressing this.
Perfect. So I'll share my screen here in just a minute, but while I'm doing that, Julian, you see Olivia asked a really good question about best practices for list views, reports, and dashboards. And should you even include those in your deployment process and review, I think is the question. So any thoughts on that while I share my screen?
Yes, and I'm looking at it. Deployments. Oh, so I'm just going to read it out. Best practice for list views, reports, and dashboards. And sorry, my screen switched around. For dashboards, we're seeing issues with deployments, overriding production changes, and I'm not seeing the value in updating those specific items via deployments, as they should be able to be manually updated in production. Great point, and I think that's something I've thought about, but never have been asked. But I've personally thought about it, and I think it gets to this like idea of, there are things within production, or I mean, there's data, there's metadata, and we typically deploy metadata, and then we kind of just we work with data, and reports, lists, reports and dashboards, and I think to an extent list views are in this interesting space. I mean, they're all technically metadata, but we also kind of like interact with them. That's a very fair question. My tendency is to think, is there, how much of this can we capture in version control and deploy safely? If it is overriding changes, I mean, just from a practical point of view, there are just things that are just not deployable in Salesforce, that are deployable with a lot of issues and are just frustrating. And that's just like the nature of the Salesforce platform and decisions that were made, I don't know, half a decade to decades ago. And it's a fair point. I would say, if at all possible, if there are ways to deploy without overwriting changes. And I'm even thinking through, does that mean having more of like templated reports and duplicating them? If that makes sense with your process. Or this would be really frustrating, but like having a deployment and then having some automation that actually runs. I guess if anything can be captured in version control, I always want to tend towards that. But the things that can't, they just can't. And you just have to have some exceptions there. And I think this could be a valid place where there's an exception. I'll also put out there, if there are exceptions, I would highly recommend having those like clearly documented. We are not deploying these things anymore for these reasons. They are creating issues. But that means that we have to manage them in probably a bit more manual way in each of these environments, especially if we want to test in the lower environments. Like if we're making changes in production, when they get back down, we have to have a way of identifying that. And so having that documented and explained out, I think was really important. And then I would say a little bit more medium to longer term, just looking at other ways to still automate that down the line, if it can, and looking at other tools out there that are not just like gonna blankly deploy into an org, but actually you can get a little bit more nuanced into how you do those deployments. Let me know if that answers the question. If not, please keep going in chat and I'll respond there.
Yeah, and I saw, before I get into my demo, I think this is really interesting. John brings up a great point, and I saw Mitch talking about it earlier. So you've obviously struck a nerve in something that people run into, right? This kind of two different systems, both with, you have admins, devs, maybe release managers, different people playing in the same kitchen, but also just different classes of data. And we're not even talking about CPQ and all these other record-based configurations that are, or database configurations. So I think it's really interesting. And one of the nice things I'm going to talk about a little bit with Salto is when you're trying to figure out what your source of truth is. Hey, is it my repository? And am I really doing a Git driven deployment strategy like a lot of devs like? Well, then you get into these situations where you might blow away manual changes in production. Or is the org the source of truth, which has its own problems and things you need to work with? So we try at Salto to really meld the best of both worlds so you can play together. So keep that in mind as we talk through this, that if you have changes like manual changes on an org, Salto will give you a really good view of, hey, you're promoting this thing and you might change this report, this dashboard, this field, this flow. Here's what's going to get edited. So you at least have visibility into the change that's going to occur, as opposed to just, boop, I'm pushing a PR. It's gonna do what the PR says. It's gonna blow it away. So keep that in mind. With that, I do want to hop in and really talk through exactly what Julian was ending there on, which is how do we get people doing the work together, be able to review each other's work, see, hey, I'm a dev, I can see the admin's work, admins can see my work. If a dev deploys into a combined dev environment or a QA environment, can I back promote that into my own sandbox so I'm playing with the same things they're playing with? These are all key pieces to being able to trust when I'm building and testing when it gets promoted. So you can see on your screen here, I pulled up Salto. I've got a number of environments connected. So I've got two sandboxes that I'm treating kind of like, individual sandboxes, place I can play, really safe. Dev, which is my kind of my combined, my first integration environment, a QA and a prod. Your QA is kind of like your stage, your UAT, whatever you might call it. Prod, self-explanatory. So I've already made some changes. I've already both in code within my Git repository, like a dev, and I've also made some changes as an admin. Just to save us a little time, so you're not watching me do, the click ops, the stuff you all know how to do. So let's start with, as an admin, I'm going to look at my pipeline here. So this pipeline, you'll notice, shows all my environments in the structure of how we expect these things to be promoted through, this environment. Two sandboxes combining into my dev, into QA, into production. This is our path. So if I wanted to, let's say, take something from sandbox CE2, which is where I was playing as an admin, and I want to promote it into Salesforce Dev, my first combined environment. I can see I've already done some promotion or some deployments into this environment earlier. Well, if I wanted to do that myself, from this pipeline view, I can ask for the info button. I can ask for a compare and deploy, which is going to do an org-to-org comparison in this case. So let's go ahead and grab CE2 there. asked for it to go from CE2 into dev. So we'll do that. I'm going to go ahead and tag this with my imaginary work item here, the DP107. And now what Salto is going to show me is, again, if you're the admin that really likes to get a clean view where I can click through, filter, see exactly, the elements that I was just working on in my UI, in the Salesforce UI in my org, that's what I can see here. So in this case, I've got some new fields that I've created that I want to promote up into this dev org. Let's go ahead and grab those. I can see I've got some account fields, a bunch of them here that I might want to add. I'm going to go ahead and grab plan type. That's the one I was working on. You'll notice this is really handy. Salto is going to automatically detect. So it's showing me it's an addition. So it's a brand new field on the account. It's going to pick up that I have a global value set that is a part of this field, right? So it's protecting me with these dependencies that, hey, this doesn't exist yet in my target. I need to make sure I take that with me. So go ahead and grab that. You wouldn't recognize this potentially until later on if you're using something like a Git repository or a Git-based flow. You'd just be looking at the code, maybe not catching that until you do your validations later on. So Salto really tries to help those people, be they junior or senior admins, really build the proper deployment in order to get to the next environment. And then, if I wanted to move additional things, I could do that in this case. So I've got some lead fields as well, CE notes and role I've added. Both of these shouldn't have any dependencies. Great. Just I've made layout changes so I can update the layout as well if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to deploy 3 fields in the related global value set. So now as an admin, I can ask for preview. And this is where the fun begins. When we start to get involved with the rest of the team. So I've set up what I am looking to deploy. Salto is going to run a preview here. So we're going to validate that I have all the dependencies, that these pieces that I like to move up into my next environment aren't going to conflict with anything. If I want to run my tests, if I want to run things like PMD, if I want to open a PR, all of these things can happen automatically. And in fact, in the background, they're going to. So once this is done previewing, you'll see that even though most admins aren't Git experts, it's going to open a PR that we can then go review. We can start to run some of those validations automatically in the background. And you'll notice that in my pipeline now, I have a draft coming out of the CE2 environment. So people can see here, and in any other view where you're looking at that target environment, you can see exactly what we're trying to deploy up into dev. So let's go ahead and leave that for now, because I do want to save time and make sure we get through all this. So as this is staging, let's go ahead and start a deployment as a dev at the same time. So I'm a dev working at the same time as a bunch of my admins. You can see here, I've got a feature branch I've already opened. So I've already gone into my IDE. I've decided to build something that I'm going to push into dev, create my feature branch like a good dev. I've pushed my changes up into Git. And now I want to create my pull request. So I can see here, I've updated this, this DP customer engineering class that I've created, some Apex code, very simple. I've decided to add some additional fields to these queries. Great, pretty standard. So let's go ahead and open this pull request. I'll give it a little better title. Again, my imaginary work item. And when I create this pull request, you'll notice I'm not doing this from within Salto, right? This is a branch. It's structured just like the SFDX repositories that you're used to. And when I create this, it's going to automatically detect that I've opened up a new pull request into a Salto managed environment. You'll notice we're kicking out some validations here. So this is going to create a deployment within Salto so that I can see right alongside what my admins are doing, a dev deployment and an admin deployment. Both can run the same validations. They can run different validations depending on how I want to organize my work. Maybe I only want to test when I have code changes, but I'll leave the fields, flows, things like that. Maybe based on what I want to do, I'm not going to require testing there. We can really customize based on what you're changing, what gets checked, but everyone's in the same space. So let's go ahead and have a look what that looks like in Salto now. So now you'll see, I have multiple drafts happening, right? I have a deployment coming into dev, shows down here. This is my PR. I've got a draft here that I can see is coming from CE2. So again, visibility into what's happening, what changes we're going to make on a given environment. Now, just to show you a different view, if I was looking at if I wanted to come in here and look at all the different deployments that are coming in to dev, we can see them right side by side, right? So no matter what, no matter where you're coming at this, Salto's going to give you everything that's trying to be done in that environment, be it a PR, admins, whatnot. So these are running tests, validating. We can see here that DP107 is actually ready to deploy, but I don't want to deploy it right now because I've already gone ahead and done a couple deployments earlier today. So if we come back to my pipeline, you'll notice, everything we've been happening over here, stuff we're pushing into dev. But if I open up dev, I can see that I've got a couple of deployments I did earlier, DP105 and DP106. What happens when I'd like to move those into QA, right? So imagine where my admin has pushed a deployment, my dev has pushed a deployment, maybe many. Now I want to go to QA and production, and complete my cycle. Maybe it's another admin, maybe it's a release manager. What does that look like? Well, now with Salto, we can just go ahead and select those and more depending on what I've tested and what's been completed, what's been authorized. I can select them, ask for a promotion. Salto is going to show me exactly what I'm promoting. So, hey, these 2 previous deployments, we're going to go ahead and move up into my QA environment. And then even though Salto is going to track these, let's say, I wanted to change this title, maybe put ticket IDs in, put a better description in, what have you. I can do that here, update this. And now when I create this deployment, Salto, notice I didn't have to open a new PR. I didn't have to go back and select everything that I want to move. It's going to take, whether it's an admin or a dev deployment, it's going to take it, collapse it into a single deployment, revalidate it, and then put it up for review again. So, and then if I want different criteria for going to QA, different people that need to review, whatnot, again, this is all something that I can create. So I have a very consistent process where everyone has visibility and the right people have access to review and move these things up. So we're going to let this build, and then when it's ready, I'll actually click it to go. Go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, to be clear, so this was both a admin deployment, a deployment from Salto, which I would call admin deployment typically, and then a dev deployment, a dev change. Those changes from 2 different roles being brought up together in a way where you can just select it. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that clarity. We're hustling through my deployments and make sure we got everything in. I didn't add that clarity. Let's go ahead. I clicked on that deployment that I'm now going to promote, and it's going to show me that previous deployment, so I can always review exactly what it is. So in this case, I had a flow and a field that I had promoted. So very admin centric. I just went in, clicked the flow, told me I had dependency, clicked that dependency, promoted that. And then 105, if we go click on that, we can see that this was a PR. I can see the PR here, pull request, and it's an update to a very simple update to that same customer engineering Apex class. So 2 different ways to come into the same spot, but then we combine them and move them on up. So
yeah, it's like I know. So full disclosure, I have seen this before, but I'm still wrapping my head around the impact is the admin didn't have to go look at the pull request to get this change in, but they still had, I saw visibility there into, they at least know what Apex class it is, what components are being modified. And then vice versa. Let's say the dev perspective was doing this, or maybe it's an architect is coming in. There still is that visibility on what the admin did. And then there's also a similar UI from what I'm seeing. Like everything is like the same visually. So you don't have to like translate, okay, this is a pull request, this is the UI tool. What do they kind of mean? Like you can all see it in one place. And then is there even a link to the, if you did have that question, let's say on the dev side, like how could you go look at that pull request and what code has been done there if you prefer to look at the code?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, you got it spot on, Julian. So here's my combined elements. So I've got this available. I've got this nice UI showing me how things are going. If I wanted to go to the previous deployment, I can click on this. There'll be a link there to go to that previous pull request. Or let's say, I'll do you one better. Let's say this is that QA deployment. Let's say my very technical release manager or someone who's responsible for QA deployments. Again, I'm automatically opening a PR. So I didn't have to go do anything in Git. I just said this deployment, I'd like to promote those. And Salto automatically generates the proper diff, opens a PR, and now gives me the ability to come in here and look at these files as code if I like. So really, I get to review and understand what's changing in the format that I like.
And with the protections you like, I would assume as well.
Yes.
Like I think you show like a validate happening
Mm-hmm.
previously just from bringing in a dev change, but I imagine, I mean, this is GitHub. So if I'm using GitHub Actions, I want some automation to run. I want some validation, various protections to
Yep.
run before this gets promoted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's
Precisely.
that's happening as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we even have customers that like to run a validation to make sure that a certain Jira ticket. So if I'm tagging my deployments with a Jira ticket ID, you can parse that. You can ask a GitHub action to go check, is it in a certain state, right? Has it reached a certain approval level, whatnot. So you have a lot of flexibility here. And even if you have some pre-existing checks that you've built with an existing pipeline, you can easily take those and plug them right in because we're integrating with, best of breed services like GitHub and GitLab and things like that.
Great. And maybe we're
Yeah.
going to look at this already, but to keep going on that protection piece, is Salto respecting the ability to merge or the lack of ability to merge if you wanted to prevent that deployment? Because presumably if Git's going to prevent it, it's not going to let it go up to the next level branch. So does Salto give you some visibility?
Exactly. Yes. So in this case, I have no conflicts and I've left this open so I didn't have to request a review from someone else. But if you go put branch protections in place, Salto is paying attention to the status of this PR. So if you just like you said, you need reviews, specific reviewers, things like that, we're going to respect that PR status. Yep. I'll even throw in an additional thing. A lot of our customers, regardless of PR status, they also say, let their devs and their admins stage deployments. So they can come in, I can create a deployment to dev or to QA, but I don't want to actually give people access, admin rights into QA or production. So Salto, you'll notice up here with my deploy button, it's enabled because I've already via OAuth given my credentials, and then Salto goes and checks, make sure I have proper access to deploy. So if I wanted to lock down my upper environments, people could still come into Salto, could start deployments, could stage things, but then would be restricted from actually doing the deployment because they don't have the right credentials. So another good way to build in protections into your process, but still give people power and visibility into these changes.
Thanks for explaining that. I'm finding that like just every time I learn something about Salto, I'll just say this interface is almost deceptively simple, because even what you said right there, the protection of deployment, that's what I would want it to do. And I'm sure I would see it when it happens, but I wouldn't know it's like actually that specific and or that it's like that, it's being that careful. Because I have seen tools just like that deploy button, for example, is you can hit it and it's going to try and it's going to break, or maybe even worse, you hit it and the user connected with GitHub does have the permissions to do that, and you've now enabled something that you don't want. some
Yep.
the person with the wrong credentials to be able to do. And so, yeah, there's a lot. Just that deploy button, as you explained it, there's a lot going on with it's why it's blue and not grayed out, for example.
Yep. It's very kind of you to say it's deceptively simple, because that is our goal. Is we want people to be able to come in and get a lot out of the tool quickly and be understandable. But if you need to go deep, if you've got very complex use cases and processes, we want to be able to meet those and support them while without scaring off 90% of your team. It's also why Salto as a tool, a lot of other tools out there are seat based, right? So if one new person to the team, cost goes up, right? With Salto, if you buy Salto, add your contractors, add everyone on your team, your managers, your release managers. It's not seat based. You can add as many people on your team as you want, because we really believe you need to have your whole team in working together, and we don't want contracts and costs to be an impediment to that. So really a philosophical difference there with how we view working in Salesforce with a tool like this. So, there's a lot more we could go over in Salto. I really wanted to show kind of this the whole way through, how we stage deployments, how we promote, how people get to work together. There's nice things in here, like the ability to do backup and restore and reverts. All that is happening automatically in the background. So we'll call that out as something that, again, it's just you get just from connecting. Don't need to do much for backup. The ability to do monitoring and impact analysis. These are all built into the tool. So as opposed to having to go get a separate tool, as I'm sure you're aware of some of those other impact analysis tools, you just get it as a part of Salto. So if you are interested in any of that, please reach out. We can always do a more in-depth demo specific to your needs. So please do that. I know there's a link that Baptiste put up earlier, and I'm sure he'll put it up again here in a minute. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share, because I think we have maybe a couple of questions, and I know we have at least one more quiz, I think Baptiste wants to put out there.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'll share a poll just on satisfaction again, and next steps. But if anybody has questions, we have 6 more minutes, so the Q&As are open, and DP and Julian are here to answer more questions, so feel free to ask them away. And I'll launch the poll in a minute.
While we're waiting potentially for some questions to come in, I did want to touch on just going back to that question about, I would say let's say non-metadata deployments, whether it's record-based config or even reports, dashboards, and how that all gets captured. Something else that occurred to me while looking at the way Salto connects with GitHub, and something I've actually tested out a bit myself, is if you are creating a deployment from Salto and it is connected to GitHub and is creating a merge request, then beyond just those abilities to like do protections, for example, from merging and things like that, you just also get the full power of GitHub Actions in general. And so, for example, if you are working with a GitHub action that does a deployment of test data, which is one fairly common scenario I've personally used GitHub Actions for, then that might be another way to selectively and more carefully capture data, not just metadata, with some GitHub action that is maybe using the Salesforce CLI and some other tools. Cumulus CI is one I like. SFDMU is another one out there specifically for data. But any of these like plugins that you might essentially plug in through GitHub Actions, you can connect those in and also have that be essentially part of a deployment selectively when it makes sense to deploy that data. So just expanding your abilities beyond metadata and beyond just like the typical style of deployments.
All right, I guess today is a shyer crowd. So if there are no extra questions, we'll just end it here for today. I shared a link to our next webinar in the chat. It's with Lars Monkvist. I'm sure I butchered his last name. And it will be on DevOps and Typewriter. It's in 2 weeks, so make sure to register. And yeah, thanks again, Julian. Thanks, TP. And thank you,
Was there a
everybody.
poll as well, Baptiste? I just want to make sure.
Yes,
Or is that separate?
the poll is live.
Oh, poll side. Okay, good.
Yeah. So yeah, again, thanks for everybody for joining today, and see you next time.
Thank you.